It was a thunderbolt moment at dawn. Armored columns once loyal to Lukashenko stalled on the outskirts of Minsk, their crews refusing orders. Gunships hovered above the presidential palace, but the guards inside would not fire. Reports filtered in that entire battalions of the Belarusian army had quietly turned against their commander. The regime's very foundations began to shudder. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and like my videos. This is the story of how the civil war in Belarus erupted, how units turned against Lukashenko, how the fragile state splintered, and how that turning point reshaped the nation's future. In order to grasp the full magnitude of what occurred, we must go back to the roots of Lukashenko's rule. For nearly 3 decades he ruled with an iron grip, suppressing dissent, neutralizing independent institutions, and cementing himself as the unchallengeable center of Belarusian power. Over time, a network of security services, pro-regime paramilitaries, secret police, and elite units like Saber and the internal troops became the scaffolding sustaining his regime, but loyalty is not indefinitely guaranteed. Beneath that monolith of control there simmered discontent among ordinary citizens, among younger officers, and in reserve formations. The spark came in August 2020, following a presidential election widely deemed fraudulent. Mass protests erupted nationwide, with hundreds of thousands taking to Minsk and regional cities. The regime responded with brutal crackdowns, beatings, mass arrests, torture. The deployment of conventional military units and internal troops made it clear that Lukashenko regarded this as an existential threat. Yet even in those darkest moments, there were early signs of fraying. Some low-level troops declined orders to fire on crowds, some units withheld participation, some military doctors quietly refused to treat wounded security forces who had violated protesters. Analysts warned the regime's militarization risked internal fracture. From 2020 into 2022, Belarus sat in a tense limbo. The opposition, though crushed, reorganized from exile. Civil society went underground. Belarusian volunteers began to join the Ukrainian side of the war, hoping that a victory in Ukraine would carry over to regime change at home. Meanwhile, Lukashenko leaned harder on Russia, accepting dependence, allowing Russian logistical and military support across Belarusian territory, and increasingly positioning Belarus as a willing enabler of the Russian war in Ukraine. Belarusian military readiness intensified, trainings and joint exercises multiplied, conscription and reservist drills became more regular, the state's coercive apparatus grew ever more militarized. Then came early 2025. Reports began leaking that units in the western region, closer to the Polish and Lithuanian borders, had quietly refused transit orders for Russian convoys. Reserve brigades in Grodno and Brest allegedly refused to move ammunition. Small sabotage actions struck supply depots in Baranovichi. In Minsk itself, rumors circulated that portions of the capital's garrison had clandestine contacts with opposition cells. Intelligence drones from neighboring states quietly tracked troop movements. And within the general staff, fissures deepened. On a cold April morning, the dramatic turning point arrived. At 4:30 local time, a mechanized brigade in the Minsk region, previously tasked with guarding the presidential compound, refused to advance when ordered. Its commander broadcast a short statement on the internal radio: "We defend the people, not tyranny." Within minutes, armored columns from 2 adjacent units joined in, surrounding key security service headquarters, cutting communications lines. Simultaneous mutinies erupted in Brest, Grodno, and Vitebsk, each declaring allegiance to a newly formed transitional military council. The mutineers broadcast to the nation, "Lukashenko no longer commands the army." The response from the regime was frantic. The Presidential Guard launched a counterattack, supported by riot police and loyal paramilitaries. Air assaults were ordered against rebel-held barracks. But mainstays of the elite Saber and 3,214 brigades were themselves under strain. Some elements defected, others took neutral positions, refusing to fire a shot. A small airstrike intended to decapitate the rebel command center misfired. Friendly fire and fog of war added confusion. The capital grew chaotic, supply lines severed, internet outages, mass evacuations. Over the next 48 hours, the conflict spread. The mutineers seized control of border crossings toward Lithuania and Poland, cutting off the regime's external lifelines. Key infrastructure, power plants, radio towers, major bridges fell into rebel hands. Loyalist forces tried to regroup in Gomel and Mogilov, but communication breakdowns and desertions hampered their response. In the corridors of power, ministers and regional governors began switching sides, sensing that the regime's cohesion had collapsed. By day 5, Minsk was effectively under rebel control, although pockets of resistance remained. Lukashenko broadcast a defiant message declaring martial law, calling for his supporters to defend the constitution. He fled to a secure location hidden in a reinforced bunker, but lost control of his security apparatus. In 6 days, the symbol of lifelong rule was a man in hiding. This was not the end. A bitter civil war raged through mid-2025. The former regime loyalists, regrouped in eastern Belarus around Mogilov and Orsha, launched counteroffensives. Russian air and missile support previously held back entered Belarus openly, attempting to prop up remaining regime forces and regain lost territory. The rebel Transitional Military Council, now the de facto government, countered with mobile brigades, guerrilla tactics, use of reserve forces, and crucially, civilian support from cities across Belarus. Many units that had been silent until that turning point now joined the rebel cause, swelling their ranks and tightening the regime's noose. Media from the outside reported daily updates. The international community scrambled. Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, and the EU condemned the crackdown and began sending humanitarian and defensive assistance to rebel-held zones. Russia issued warnings, threatened intervention. Moscow urged stability, but behind the scenes scrambled to decide whether to back Lukashenko or shift to a new puppet. The mutiny, analysts warned, had shattered the illusion of Belarus as a seamless Russian ally. By late 2025, territory control had largely settled, the West and center under the Transitional Military Council, the East under regime remnants with Russian support. Minsk became a frontline city. Skirmishes, sniper fire, drone attacks, sabotage, urban warfare, the capital was torn. Millions were displaced, the regime's internal lines were cut. The rebels sought to strangle remaining strongholds by blockades, cutting roads, congesting supply chains. In early 2026, negotiations began under international pressure. A shaky ceasefire was brokered under UN monitoring. Lukashenko, now detained by a faction of former security officers who had turned, was presented with surrender demands. He refused at first, trying to negotiate immunity. The rebel council demanded full disarmament, a transitional government, constitutional reform, and foreign troop withdrawal. The tug of war lasted months. Finally, in June 2026, Lukashenko capitulated. He was put under house arrest in a heavily guarded location. The Transitional Military Council assumed full power, setting up elections, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a security purge. Russian forces that had entered Belarus were pressured by diplomatic and economic incentives to withdraw. A residual force stayed under UN oversight to stabilize border zones. What caused this seismic shift? The catalysts were many. Lukashenko's decades of autocracy had left little institutional loyalty beyond personal loyalty. The brutal crackdown of 2020 had sown resentment even in security ranks. The open cooperation with Russia during the Ukraine war made Belarus a theater in a foreign war, alienating many patriots. The opposition's prolonged struggle, especially via Belarusian fighters in Ukraine, nurtured an armed ethos that could return home. The regime's increasingly militarized strategies, mass drills, joint exercises, overt presence of Russian units strained morale and legitimacy, and when crack points appeared, a disobedient brigade, quiet refusals, hesitation in elite units, they cascaded into full mutiny. The consequences were immediate and profound. Belarus, once a seemingly stable dictatorship, was now a shattered state in transition. The security services were decimated or purged. The chain of command had been broken. The new government had to rebuild institutions, judiciary, police, courts, civil control over the military. Political prisoners were freed, many exiled opposition leaders returned, the economy, ravaged by war and sanctions, struggled to revive. The reliance on Russia had been exposed as a weakness, leading many to pivot toward the EU, seeking investment, aid, and integration. Internationally, the shock ripple was enormous. Russia's influence in Belarus was demonstrably broken. A Russian-backed dictator had been deposed by his own armed forces. Neighboring countries watched in alarm. The EU and NATO had to reassess security on the Belarus border. The Kremlin's narrative of frozen stable regimes was fracturing. For Ukraine, Belarus's uprising was a moral beacon. If a client state of Russia could revolt, so could others. The West's political capital surged, but the war in Belarus cautioned that transitions are ugly, never clean. Looking ahead, the risk remains high. Belarus could fracture further. The eastern provinces with deeper regime memory might resist full reconciliation. Russian irredentist factions might try intervention again under pretexts of protecting minority populations or restoring order. Hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation will continue. The new government must carefully manage military integration, vet ex-servicemen, prevent coups, and legitimize their rule through elections and transparency. The constitutional overhaul must balance central authority with democratic checks. International support will be vital both for reconstruction and for security guarantees. The symbolic lesson is clear. Absolute power built on fear can collapse when loyalty cracks, when a spark meets tinder. The mutiny of army units in Belarus was not the cause but the culmination of decades of misrule, external entanglements, and suppressed dissent. In the space of weeks, Belarus transformed from a pillar of Putin's regional order into the epicenter of an unpredictable transition. If you imagine the scenes inside the barracks on that first mutiny day, soldiers staring at orders they once carried out without question, hesitation in the chain of command, whispers over encrypted radios, the fear that their fellows might fire on them, you see how brittle loyalty can be. Once one unit refused, others followed. Once the elite forces trembled, the regime's myth of invincibility shattered. Today, many Belarusians look toward their future with guarded hope. The trauma of war lingers, but the possibility of democratic governance, of accountability, of freedom from fear, gives meaning to their losses. The transitional government faces daunting tasks: how to integrate former regime forces, how to prevent revenge justice, how to stabilize the border, and how to keep foreign actors from exploiting their fragility. The memory of the mutiny of that moment when soldiers said no more will echo for generations. This is how civil war began, how soldiers turned, how Lukashenko fell, and how the consequences continue to reshape Belarus and the region. Thank you for following this disquieting but vital story. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think Belarus's next chapter will be?